You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Thursday, March 1st, 2018. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, author of Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. Meanwhile, following last month's U.S. announcement, Putin unveils new nukes. Kushner's been using the White House as an ATM. Meanwhile, West Virginia teachers want an even bigger win in their ongoing strike. Hope Hicks leaves the White House with the tail between her legs. And 30 Trump aides lose their security clearance. Meanwhile, Trump pretends he cares about gun control while Australia collects 60,000 guns. Steve Mnuchin has a cry. Alex Jones is facing legal issues, and Trump's Nobel Peace Prize nomination, a forgery. Meanwhile, Disney's tax reform bonus, not enough as theme park workers start picketing. Sanders teams with Lee on a Yemen resolution. All this and more on today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Folks, as you know, Windows treatments is one of those soulless adulting terms. I guess that's what you call it now, right? The millennials, adulting. Like, I'm going to now get window treatments so that I'm considered an adult.
I'm going to now
For Matt, it would just be like, I will actually engage in eating cereal, despite the fact that I have to wash out a bowl. However, you don't think about these things. When they're right, everything in your home looks better, but when they're wrong, everything in your home looks like garbage. But let's be honest, when you take the time to pick out and buy blinds, it sounds expensive, it sounds boring, and frankly, overwhelming to me. Blinds.com makes it really easy for you. If you're not sure what you want or even where to start, with Blinds.com, you get a free online design consultation. You send them pictures of your house. They send you back custom recommendations from a professional for what will work with your color scheme, your furniture, your specific rooms. They'll even send you free samples to make sure everything looks as good in person as it does online, and every order gets free shipping. And this is the best part. This is what they call the Michael Brooks clause. If you accidentally mismeasure or pick the wrong color, or if you screw up, Blinds.com will remake your blinds for free. They've made it very easy for you. There's no excuse to leave up those mangled blinds that makes your place look like a set from The Wire.
Very millennial.
It's almost like pre-millennial, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a bit.
For a limited time, get up to 20% off of everything at Blinds.com when you use the promo code MAJORITY. That's Blinds.com, promo code MAJORITY for up to 20% off of everything. Faux wood blinds, cellular shades, roller shades, and more. Blinds.com, promo code MAJORITY. Rules and restrictions apply. So I've got some sad news from my perspective, hopefully from yours as well. Barry Crimmins, who had announced just about 3 or 4 weeks ago on Twitter that he had cancer, has passed away. Barry was one of basically the founders of the Boston comedy scene in the 1980s, out of which, folks like Stephen Wright, Dennis Leary, Jay Leno, a bunch of people came out of that scene. And it was at the Ding Ho. It was a Chinese restaurant, actually, technically, I guess, in Somerville. And when I was starting out in comedy, working in cross comedy and as a stand-up, Barry was one of, sort of the legends and godfathers of the comedy scene at that time. He also was the only person, there may have been one or two other people who were doing some political comedy, but his comedy was an act of social activism. And I can tell you that this phenomena where comedians are political in any fashion is relatively new. This is a phenomenon that has started maybe 10 years ago. Prior to that, you were largely ostracized to do political comedy. And he went beyond that because he just basically would work outside of the normal comedy circles. I mean, he certainly, back in the day, got on some of the late-night shows. But he was much more likely to appear with Howard Zinn than he would in, your local Chuckles comedy hut. I guess it must have been in the early 90s. Cross Comedy, this group that I was involved in, guys like Benjamin and David Cross and others, we did a benefit that Barry had put together. I think it was for the Southern Poverty Law Center, now that I think about it. And Barry announced on stage that he's come to the realization that he had been molested as a child and as a young child. And he went on to become an activist in the as the AOL America Online sort of forums developed. They were basically harboring pedophiles, and he went on to testify in front of Congress and to shame AOL into stop providing safe harbor for these people. He was, for a big part of his life, had some battles with booze. I remember an evening in Somerville, him sitting in our apartment, me and John Benjamin, watching Barry down a case of like Schlitz or whatever it was, and then a rather large bottle of liquor. But later, I hooked up with Barry. He was a writer for Air America, and wrote very poignant stuff. He wrote a book, Never Shake Hands with a War Criminal, based upon, or at the very least, the title came from a moment that he had with Henry Kissinger. I'm not going to say more about that because tomorrow what we're going to do is rerun the interview we did with Barry, I think about 2 years ago. And I have some regret. When I saw that he had cancer, I wanted to bring him back on the show. I had no idea that it was this aggressive. And but Barry Crimmins, you should check out his latest special. I heard it was great. I haven't seen it yet, but you should also see the documentary that Bobcat Goldthwait made about him, Call Me Lucky. A fantastic, you get a fantastic sense of who Barry was and of his import. So we will replay that interview with Barry Crimmins tomorrow on the show. And rest in peace. He really did have a tremendous amount of influence on a lot of comedians. A lot of people came out of Boston. I can't imagine there's anybody who does political comedy in any shape or form today that wasn't in some way inspired by Barry Crimmins. So rest in peace. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. We'll be right back after this.
Kids with guns, kids with guns, taken over, but it won't be long. They're mesmerized, skeletons. Kids with guns, kids with guns. Easy does it, they got something to say. Drinking out, pacify, in the souls. The street desire doesn't make sense to me, but it won't be long. Kids with guns, kids with guns. Easy.
We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz for her latest, entitled "Loaded: A Disarming History of the Second Amendment." Welcome back to the program, Roxanne.
Thank you, Sam.
So let's start with, and I was, I don't know that I was necessarily surprised, but I guess I was a little bit surprised. You you know, one of the things that we hear when we talk about gun control, or we talk about guns, is the complaint that the left doesn't know anything about guns. These people don't know anything about guns, and so they don't have a right to talk about it. You certainly have a little bit of experience in terms of guns and frankly, an arsenal. Tell us, let's start with that.
Yeah, well, I call it's not a memoir, the book, but I have only two entries, that beginning one and one under the Confederate guerrillas, Jesse James and all them, in the book, because I just thought it was important, to bring in what I had experienced. And so I understand, in some ways, I call it gun love because, in 1970, living in New Orleans and organizing, and just back, we had a women's study action group against the war and, against racism and the usual 1960s stuff. But we had just, several of us had gone to Cuba on the Vince Ramos Brigade. And at that time, there were these Cuban exile terrorist groups that were, killing people who went to Cuba, people in the Vince Ramos Brigade, and threatening them and so forth. Plus, we had David Duke, newly christened as the Ku Klux Klan grand whatever. And they were calling us on the phone, threatening us. They would leave things that looked like bombs on the porch. We lived in a very rickety wooden house in a really poor district, Irish Channel. And so we decided to arm ourselves. And of course, we were inspired by the Black Panthers. We supported the Black Panthers. We hadn't thought of arming ourselves. Whether underground, all these different groups underground, only they weren't much into guns. It was more bombs.
Right.
And kind of a show more than any kind of real terrorism. But we, there were no gun. We researched there's no gun laws in Louisiana, none whatsoever, except building an arsenal. But an arsenal, the definition of an arsenal, is more than 50 guns accumulated to commit a crime. So, almost no one qualifies for that except maybe the local mafia, but they never got arrested.
And theoretically, I guess that is only something you could be arrested for in retrospect, right? I mean...
Right, yeah.
Until you commit that crime,
exactly.
I mean, you're not going to say,
right.
Well, that's why we had these, but yes.
And there were some federal restrictions, crossing state lines, and I think still there was still an automatic weapon ban then. But we really had nothing to worry about, and we went to their gun shows every weekend, several in the area. So we went to one in Slidell, and this became our main place to purchase guns. Absolutely. Well, there were no background checks in even the regular gun stores. But you could get cheaper guns. You could get used M1s, rifles and shotguns that were in very good condition, but from individual sellers who charged much less and, in the gun shops. But we also started visiting the gun shops. And what happened to us is, well, New Orleans is very humid, for one thing. So at any rate, you have to clean guns all the time, clean and oil them and caress them and, have them in your lap and play around with them all the time. And they're very powerful instruments. I had grown up in a gun culture in rural Oklahoma. My dad and my brothers all had guns. My mother was terrified of guns, so she didn't let me and my sister touch them. And I was terrified of guns. My mother put the fear in me, and it was very controversial in lots of fights over guns in my house. But they were there, and the Winchester and the shotgun. No sidearms, no pistols or anything around that rural area. But, guns were really a part of the culture. And my mother was a weird exception because all the women, shot too. They had no problem with guns. So she was weird in many ways, but fortunately. But we started getting attached to these guns. All our meetings were, we were talking while we were cleaning our guns and we started talking more and more about guns and going to target practice and really enjoying it and getting a lot of sidearms and going to indoor practice. So I call it gun love. I think it's a form of addiction.
What is it? I mean, what is it about guns that drive that? I mean, what is it?
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's really smart for people not to play around with guns because it's sort of like an alcoholic, trying to drink or a drug addict trying to drink. But once you're hooked on them, what it is, they're erotic. The Marine Corps thing of, this is my rifle, this is my gun. They point to their groin. One is for killing and one is for fun. And so there's this, this empowerment. You put a gun in your hand, and many people testify to this. I've seen many articles lately. Put a weapon in your hand, either on your shoulder or a firearm, and fire it. And it is the most incredible experience that I don't want people to have because there's no need for it. It's like, it's like it's not a toy, and it's not really a tool. And people I would say most people who are gun nuts are actually addicted to guns because they're only 30% of the population owns these 300 million guns.
Right.
Only 30% of the population. And the average gun owner owns 8. So that means, some own 15, 20. It would, when the Las Vegas shooter, killed 48 people, and it was found that he had dozens and dozens. I think they finally found 55 or so in all its different hidey holes, all legal. That's, for the gun hoarder, they like to call themselves collectors or hobbyists, but I call them gun hoarders. That's an addiction, and
right.
That's nothing, having more than 50 guns. It doesn't, it doesn't bring a ripple of being something out of the ordinary. But to ordinary people who are not addicted, it does. And also, the statistic of it is mainly white men, who own these weapons of this 30%. And a good many of them, a good percentage of them, are combat veterans. And I think the uptick we've seen, it's not mass shootings started in the 1960s or that they've been done, but several of them have been done by combat vets. But I think it's simply that they collect. The more guns have collected, more guns are in circulation. And the wars themselves, kids growing up watching all this real war. I think much more than videos. Hollywood gets blamed a lot, but that's a fantasy world that I think, like horror stories when you're a kid. It's much more the real life wars, and then this sanctification of the combat vet, coming back from those wars that has risen again, and the privileges they get and the honors they get, and all these interviews, especially the liberal media, MSNBC and CNN, they love to bring on these combat vets who preface what they're going to say, that they do want some gun control, over semi-automatic weapons, and how those are just for them, for the military.
Right.
But they start talking about all their arsenal of guns and how their wives are, everyone is armed, and how important the Second Amendment is, and but they're calling for some gun control. And these are the people who have credibility, that are given credibility. And they're not to be trusted. I mean, this is not a credible source to ask about gun control, because basically they're saying, mentally ill. So stigmatizing the mentally ill, who, are more the victims of crime, of violence, than they are perpetrators. And also just having no funding for mental illness that exists. And then some things are called mental illness that are not. White nationalism permeates this society.
Well, let's go back here. This is a good opportunity before we get to that sort of what is part of that culture, if we can call it that, or that addiction on some level. Let's start where you do after you talk about your brief, I guess, phase as what some people call an amosexual. I've heard used.
Yeah.
But the historical context around the Second Amendment on the left, or the anti-gun, I should say, maybe the gun control side of things, there is a belief that the Second Amendment was never to apply to individual rights. And now, and I also just want to say that, like, the Constitution evolves with changing circumstances, and it wasn't until 2008, in the Heller case, I believe it was, that the Supreme Court finally ruled that it was an individual right. I think that's. I think there's fluidity in that, obviously, and I think the Supreme Court, the fact that they first ruled on it in 2008, I think is a perfect example of that. But you argue in the book, from an historical standpoint, it wasn't about a necessarily a well-regulated militia, was it?
Well, it is a well-regulated militia, but these militias that were provided for were volunteer citizens militias. They were very well organized, self-organized, to kill Indians, and take their land. And then later they're self-organized to control enslaved Africans with slave patrols. So this is like in the 17th century, the first documentation I found of it is 1632, only 1635, only 15 years after the Pilgrims, that they already were requiring, the colonial government was requiring that every man have a firearm in his home and a certain amount of gunpowder and bullets to load them, and cannot go out the door without being armed, including going to church or any public spaces, or out into the fields, to work. Be armed with a gun slung over his shoulder. So these were, this is the nature of settler colonialism. Is the settlers themselves are very self-organized in grabbing land, grabbing wealth. So here are these people from England, where only the crown owned all the land and only granted it to lords, to use it and everyone else was without any land rights whatsoever. So they come, what attracts them to come is free land, that they too can be a lord, they too can later be a capitalist, own property. So this is a tremendous incentive to carry out what, the colonial governments couldn't really do, and there are not enough redcoats, or they don't know how to do that kind of counterinsurgent, attacking civilians and burning down. So the British citizen settlers do that. So what it really does, and it's really important, when people say that it's what meant the National Guard, they haven't read the Constitution. It's not hard to find it, that the fact that a standing army was created in the Constitution, and the state militias, which came to be the National Guard, exactly in the description in the Constitution, is what the National Guard does today, is provided for in the Constitution. So why would this amendment in an individual rights, Bill of Rights, be put there if it's not meant to be an individual right? I think it is meant. It was meant. That's why it has to be questioned. And we do have this sanctification of the U.S. Constitution, which is abnormal. Most countries don't even have a constitution, like Great Britain, and they get along fine. They have laws, they don't have a constitution. France has had many, every generation practically. They have a new constitution, a whole new one. They don't just amendment. And the way they set it up for amendments, it can take a lifetime or never. There's still not an equal rights amendment because so many states have to do it, and it has to pass 3/4 of Congress, and it's an impossible task. And there are actually very few amendments to the Constitution, and took a civil war, to end slavery and take that out. And it took, huge movements to get women's right to vote. And this is, it's not easy to amend the Constitution. So it's set up then as as a sacred right, and that's how some of the evangelicals. I just read in the paper this morning about one that's
I'm sorry, we just
ceremony.
Your phone just got a little bit. I don't know if you just shifted around, but you're getting a little bit muffled.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
There you go. Well, let me just ask you about this before we move on to the sort of the sacredness of it, because the argument that I have heard in terms of like what the theory as to why that was put in the Constitution was so that individuals, or the citizenry, will not be subject to the tyranny that Europeans experienced from monarchs, right? That this is a way to ensure that the citizenry will not be subjected to the tyranny of government. And to be clear, your argument is, in fact, no. It was basically a way of ensuring that Americans were able to sort of maintain an imperialistic project in what was America at that time, and an imperialistic project that involved essentially violence against indigenous people.
Right, and the independence, the War of Independence, was, and you can see in the Declaration of Independence, the enumerated reasons for this, and you have to get down a little ways, to where they did not control the savage Indians on the frontier that attacked them when they would try to take their land. And they called them savages. So this the French and Indian War, after the French and Indian War, when Britain won against France, and France had to cede that whole territory they claimed, which was over the Appalachian Mountains up into Canada, but only for trading posts. They were settler colonialists in other places later on in Algeria, but in this case, the lucrative fur trade, it was one of the biggest capitalist items. And very early on, the biggest corporation, Astor Fur Company, and all these fur companies. And so and most of these animals were trapped. They didn't actually use guns that much, by the way, they weren't just going out and hunting. And they got Native people, it was a form of colonialism. They got Native people very caught up in this, where they were basically the proletariat, bringing in the stuff to sell at the trading posts. So that was allowed to continue, the traders, this trade that the Britain would just allow that whole area to be Indian country. They called it Indian country, and free of any settlement. And they did a proclamation drawing a line at the mountain range, Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains. And during this period, and even during the French and Indian War, and even before, there were settlers going out, including these militias, George Washington's militia, these planters' militias. They were going out and actually taking mapping, survey teams, surveying the land and coming back and selling unceded Indian land and that was what the proclamation was about, to prevent that, because it caused the Native people to then fight them and keep them out. And they didn't want any more war with France, basically Britain. It wasn't they had any sympathy for the Native people. They just didn't want to have European. They wanted to go colonize India and not be in European wars anymore. So it was their own self-interest, but it was to the advantage and a great victory for the indigenous people to be able to maintain their freedom. So George Washington was a mainland speculator. They all were. The founders were all, they were slavers, okay, but, that was just normal at the time, as if it was normal. And they were, but they weren't, they weren't crass. They were kind of, democratic aristocrats, how they're portrayed, but they were land speculators. All of them were real estate men. I've said Trump is actually the embodiment of the founders. They were all, even the ones from the North, they were all land speculators. Land, what came to be real estate, and in the Northwest Ordinance, which preceded the Constitution and became a part of it, they had mapped out that land. They have the maps in the Northwest Ordinance. Northwest meant Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, not Oregon and Washington yet. It was an imperialist project, and they actually did have these maps drawn, as the destination being the Pacific Ocean. So that's what Britain was preventing, is the continuation of imperialism in North America. They wanted out of it. So basically, they took over the U.S. and continued that, became much more powerful than Britain or any other power in the world or in any other power in human history. So that's exceptional. There's so many things exceptional about the United States that when we most historians, and, I was trained in history by these historians who write this stuff, and they're so Eurocentric. They look back for any predecessors, in European history, and they don't see the Native resistance and real estate as they're finally coming to see that the Cotton Kingdom was the fountain of building U.S. capitalism and was actually not in the northern industrial area and that slavery was encoded into it, as well as ethnic cleansing east of the Mississippi.
And so the analogy is that in many respects, the gun rights is also, its DNA is founded upon the imperialist project. And it's interesting, we interviewed William Hoagland a couple of months ago, who wrote Autumn of the Black Snake. And the creation, his argument is that largely the creation of a U.S. Army was a function of that same land speculation. That
absolutely.
And that this is, and so there was, and I guess your argument is that this is the antecedent to that in many respects.
Well, it's a dance. I call it a dance. It's the settler dance with the state, because the state then is, validates the takeover by settlers. And yes, there's suspicion of the state. There's hatred for the federal government, partly the lost cause, but also, this populism and a very big dose of anti-Semitism, of Jews controlling everything, banks and so forth. So that goes way back then, without hardly any Jews even present. So that's very deep in the European tradition that certainly got transported. So there's, this vilification of the federal government, but that's really a part of this dance, that has made the United States a powerful settler state. There's never been another settler state like that that has become an imperialist power. There's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Argentina. They all had hopes of being imperialist, but they didn't succeed. Our South African apartheid regime, and they didn't succeed. The United States succeeded. And it was partly that building up a huge army and the Marine Corps. They usually get left out, but the Marine Corps was founded by the Continental Congress. It was founded even before the Constitution. And it was founded as really a prototype of counterinsurgency. And it was the main, then they went overseas, the Barbary Wars. Their anthem comes from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And no one ever asked, what's this Tripoli doing in there? And the Marine hymn that was written in 1848 while they were occupying Mexico City, the halls of Montezuma. So, they're a very important factor that kind of get left out. I love Hoagland's work, by the way. I'm glad you interviewed him. I think that book is I have it so marked up. It's like every page. Yeah. It's just brilliant. So I think, though, there is a tendency not to see the power of Native nations at that time, because there's a stereotype of Neolithic hunter-gatherers wandering around in, untended forests, and that's just ridiculous. This was one of the seven founding areas of agricultural civilization 15,000 years ago. It was thoroughly cultivated. The forests were cleared they had animal husbandry where they created game parks that the deer and other animals would come to them, and they lived free until they had to be taken to be eaten, but they didn't go out tromping around in the woods hunting, and they had manicured the whole continent. There's a wonderful book on this called 1491 by Charles Mann that uses all the new, archaeology and everything. And it's a really mind-blowing, because people admit, that Central Mexico was a great agricultural civilization, or the Andes, but North America, they see as, it was just untamed savages, a different breed of human, even Paleolithic, rather than a human.
Roxanne, well, let's, we don't, I know we have a time constraint. So I just want to draw that line, because you draw the line in your book from that first, the guns are basically the currency in which the U.S. expansion takes place, where where the Constitution recognizes the desire and the need to empower citizens to go out and essentially expand the U.S. territories by killing indigenous people. And then we see the relationship of the gun sort of become also more for policing and for hunting down. You go through slave patrols and the learning of savage war, and just what is that thread? I mean, that thread that starts with the violence against indigenous people and then also, extends or maybe not mutates, but is, follows the contextual need into violence against slaves and Africans in this country, and then goes through to it becomes a right that is promoted most heavily by the KKK. This is post Reconstruction. We're talking about 1920s and the sort of the reemergence of the KKK, or perhaps maybe not the reemergence, but the strengthening as a function of post Reconstruction. Where does it go from there as it travels to where it is today?
Well, that's the key question, because there was never any legislation or discussion. There was actually some legislation in the 1930s to ban the Thompson machine gun that was being used by the gangs in Chicago, and NRA came and testified in favor of that ban. But it was taken for granted. And I said, at that point, let's say in 1940. At that point in time, the entire continent, the entire nation was locked down as a white republic. African Americans were totally under Jim Crow. They didn't need the Klan anymore. The Klan became the policemen all throughout the South. They just took off their hoods and became the sheriffs and the policemen. And they rose, immediately after the end of the Civil War, and they were tolerated by the Northern. One general said, Union General, United States General in the occupation, said that it would take 100 times more people and soldiers than even exist in the Army to get rid of the KKK in the South. It was all over. All those slave patrols turned into KKK, and then they turned into police. So by 1880, Jim Crow was fully in place. In 1940, it was fully in place, unshaken. And Indians were confined to reservations. And in 1953, they were terminated. Their rights were terminated, and they started moving people on relocation to different cities. So they were scattered. The youth were scattered, and that kind of backfired because they became the American Indian movement. But it was, and it took 20 years to stop that. 1975 to stop it. Did a great deal of damage, a great deal of loss. So in 1940, everything was locked down. Mexicans were braceros, had no rights whatsoever. And then there was Operation Wetback, as they called it, to simply haul off anyone, citizen or not, and deport them because they know, they had, all the Dust Bowl refugees and others to do the work, and other immigrants, and who would work for less pay, even
right.
than cost less than the braceros. So it was locked down. But in the civil rights movement, there was W.B. Du Bois.
So Roxanne, let me just understand. So the point that it was locked down is what, that was the opportunity to start to promulgate gun control because there was
No. Let me finish.
Okay,
I'll
sorry.
explain it. It wasn't there was nothing about gun control whatsoever. It was the desegregation decision of the Supreme Court in 1954 that was an explosion. And this, of course, was years and decades of NAACP work of building case law and documenting it and winning that. That was a huge victory for the civil rights movement. And the writing was on the wall for, white nationalism. And this was like the huge corporate giants, the defense industry in California, the oil and gas, the Orange County, core that produced the John Birch Society that spread all over the place. And they created this kitchen table writing letters, of taking over school boards all over the place. And it was founded by Fred Koch was one of the founding members of the Koch Industries. Welch was the candy manufacturing, Scion. These were wealthy people, so it really came from the top, the first organization. But then it offered, white supremacy had always been also a privilege of, anyone over African Americans or Indians or Mexicans. So this was then became a threat. It was also merged with anti-communism. They were all communists, they put that label on, and then, the 50s, the McCarthy era. But you get to 1977, and by that time there are proliferations of white nationalist, really fascist groups. And they, one of them that formed in 1974, the Second Amendment Foundation in the state of Washington, a former border guard, a vicious man, Harlan Carter, founded that organization, white supremacist organization, very openly. They infiltrated, for 3 years, they infiltrated the NRA, a membership organization, a legitimate corporation. And they took over. In 1977, they took over the NRA. And that's when the NRA started talking. They never talked about the Second Amendment. No one talked about the Second Amendment. There was no legislation. There also wasn't much gun control, very little. But, it wasn't an issue until these armed groups, the John Birch Society had the Minutemen, these armed white groups, started promoting arming the people. And then Reagan, who was, in bed with the John Birch Society when he became governor, they proliferated in California under him, and then he became president. So the 80s was just this huge outburst. And of course, it was also at the time of deindustrialization. So all these, really white privileged union white workers, because they, excluded blacks from main occupations, they were easy recruits because they had a beef against the government, and it empowered them, and they saw blacks or immigrants, Mexicans as competition for their jobs. So they were easy prey for being recruited to these organizations. Farmers, that.
Roxanne, let me just ask you one question. How did Reagan's relationship with the John Birch Society intersect with his promotion of gun rights in the 70s as a backlash to the Black Panthers? And I know that you got to go in a minute or two. So,
yeah. Well, that was in the 1960s, that the Panthers armed.
60s.
But and he was governor at the time. But he, that was purely racist. That's why I say that, for real freedom movements, the Second Amendment is no protection for their right to protect their community. The Black Panthers had absolutely legal loaded shotguns, open carry. That was, and that bill that went in the state legislature preceded the Black Panthers. It takes a long time for a bill to go through, but it was a very tepid bill, to control. But it was a kind of publicity stunt for the Panthers to oppose the bill and, and go with their open carry shotguns. I think they partially believed it would protect them, but clearly it didn't. And the bill passed like crazy. It wasn't expected to pass. All the people in the Valley were against it, and Reagan was against it. He wasn't pushing for it. But there was a change of hearts, when blacks got armed like that. So I'm saying that probably would work better than anything right now. But now they would just kill them all, instead of arresting them. So that gets twisted as a story. And there's so many attempts to whitewash Reagan. He was a true fascist. I mean, he was embedded in the military industrial complex, in the oil and gas, in the agriculture, commercial agriculture, feeding all the water to these wealthy growers in the Valley, hated Mexican Americans. When he was inaugurated, he went to visit Neshoba, Mississippi, where the civil rights workers had been killed.
His 1980
he
race,
announced his. Exactly. He had so many signals going. They were mainly dog whistles then, but people got it.
Well, Roxanne, I know you have to go, and I appreciate your talking with us. The book is loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. It's a fascinating account of the genesis of the, I guess, the gun love in this country, or the sacredness of the gun within the American ethos. And so I appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you, Sam. And I'm very impressed and proud of you for standing up to some right-wingers a few months ago.
Well, yes, my pleasure. I appreciate that.
A little victory for all of us.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks, we will put a link, obviously, to Loaded on the site at majority.fm. I'm going to take a quick break, head into the fun half. Just a reminder, folks, it is your support that makes this show possible. When you become a member of the Majority Report, you make it possible for us to do the free show every day, which more often than not involves a long-form interview with an author or perhaps a reporter and or a journalist who's written a long-form piece. And then when you become a member, we give you extra content that involves some funniness and silliness sometimes, and maybe also not so funny and silly. Just varying stuff. You never know. You never know. We never know, folks.
It's a real mixed bag.
It's a total mixed bag. There are times where people say, like, what is the planning process for the show? And it's basically, it's secret. Of course, we can't tell you. It involves all of us being here, or most of us on some days. That's basically it. But you can become a member of this program by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. It is literally pennies a day to continue to help us to do what we do. As I always say, we do not want access to the fun half of the program to be a function or access denied to be a function of your financial situation. We have a lot of folks who run into financial problems. They lose their job, or maybe they're caring for a parent, or they themselves have suffered medical issues. We never, ever exclude anyone based on financial reasons. So if you have an issue with finances and you want the access to the fun half, just send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. We don't ask you to justify it. So you don't need to do that. If it's you just got to tell us you want access. You can't swing it at this time, and that is fine. But for those of you who do have the financial means and you enjoy the program on a regular basis, your support makes it possible for us to do that. So join themajorityreport.com. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. Don't forget TMBS on our YouTube channel, and you can get it on iTunes. And Jamie's Patreon is at patreon.com/Jamie Peck. 646-257-3920 is the number if you want to be a part of this program going forward today. Of course, you can IM us also via the app. And the app is free for both iOS and Android. Pick it up at majorityapp.com.